All right, so the OAuth package. So one of the things I always do whenever I see a new package is I examine its GoDoc, because oftentimes people's examples or their getting started pages will be out of date or something, but the GoDoc is always accurate because it's always matching the actual code. But for some packages, the documentation can be a little confusing. So for example, new client is something I see a lot as something I want to do, but that's not the first place I should go because it says token source. And then I go down at token source and I'm like, okay, what's a token source? It's this interface and here's how to create them. That's not quite what you want either. What you actually want for the OAuth2 package is this config type. So the config type is this struct, and this contains everything that your app will need for this particular OAuth. So when you do OAuth, you'll go to whatever website that you're getting your OAuthing to, say Google or GitHub or Facebook, and you'll sign up to be an OAuth, to use OAuth with there, and they will give you a client ID and a client secret. And so those two just need to go into this struct here. You'll also need an endpoint. An endpoint is just a struct that has two URLs, an auth URL and a token URL, and an auth style. The auth style, you can just believe that it's a 0 value generally. So, but these two URLs, auth URL, token URL, you'll have to look at the documentation for whatever site you're using for what those values are. But there's also, in the OAuth package, there's a bunch of sub-packages that are generally very small, and they just have an endpoints for that. OAuth2 endpoints, just those two URLs filled out. So here's the GitHub's endpoints. So you don't even have to look. So for a lot of the most common ones, it's all available here at the bottom of the page of the OAuth2's GoDoc.
What's that one? Go down. Cacao? Never heard of that. Or Odnoklassniki?
I think that's Russian.
Wow.
Yep.
No, interesting. Never heard of that website.
Yep. So yeah. So if you somehow come across some OAuth provider that's not pre-made, you just have to look at their documentation to figure out where their auth URL and token URL are, and you can just create your own instance of OAuth2 endpoint. So besides OAuth2 endpoint, so you need your client ID, your client secret from the website. You need to have the endpoints. When you sign up, you will also create a redirect URL. This is after the user goes to that other website, they sign in, they hit approve, that website redirects them back to your website. That's what this URL is. Where should they redirect the user back to? And then finally, scopes. If you've got any special permissions you need to ask for. So like, I need access to your Google Drive folder in addition to the public information. That would go in the scopes list. So you fill out this config struct, and once you've filled it out, it will give you, it's got several methods on it.
Well, how did you get to the top? Just back arrow? You did that by instinct. You weren't even aware of
it. Something like that, yeah. So because I clicked that, and so back arrow goes back to where it was before.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if that's a Firefox specific thing or if all browsers do that. I always use Firefox, so.
So you do your config, and then once you have config, you have all those functions available.
Yep. So yeah, you can generally set this config as like a package level variable because it's generally you only need it the once you need it globally for your app. So GitHub config, you'll usually just have this filled out, an instance of this filled out at the top of a file somewhere. Once you've got that, the three functions that you need specifically are auth code URL, exchange, and token source. So auth code URL, you give it some state string. This can be whatever string you kind of come up with. So presumably some sort of like maybe an ID of some database entry or something. Someone's trying to log in. Here's the ID. So just some random value. When the user redirects back to you, the OAuth will give this back to you. Will give this back to you as well. So you can use it to look up stuff. And there's also auth code option. Auth code option is there's three possible options. access type online, access type offline. Online means your access will only last a couple hours. Offline means the token they give you can potentially last indefinitely. So if you're only using it to log in, then online's all you need. If you're doing something like migrating a Dropbox to somewhere else, you might need offline because you may need it for over a couple hours.
And they'll have gone offline by then, and you still need to do it.
Yeah. So yeah, generally online is the user sitting at the browser the entire time. Offline is you need to keep access even when the user's left their computer, or left your website. And then approval force will tell the OAuth site to always force them to check their permissions, even if they've already granted you permissions in the past.
Cool.
So generally speaking, you can just leave them as the defaults. Online is the default, I believe. Although it depends on which website you're going to. But it's usually just online. So generally speaking, you just need to auth-code URL in a state, and that'll give you back the URL that you want to put the user at. And that URL will have everything in the query parameters as necessary for the user to log in and give your website permissions.
So the state is, what is the state
some
again?
string that you created on your server.
Okay.
So I like to use the ID of a database entry which has information on this login attempt.
Okay. So we do, looking at my screen, we have create a config struct.
Create config struct.
And then once we've created a config struct, we call the auth-code URL method.
Yep.
And then
and pass in state, which is some string.
Yeah.
When
state is some string.
So just they could be anything. They will give it back to you.
Like a session ID?
Yeah. For this particular login attempt.
Okay.
Or access
Or just
attempt.
some unique identifier for this login attempt?
Yeah.
Unique ID for this login attempt. Okay.
So that'll give you back the string that you want to redirect your users to.
Okay.
So once the user goes to that URL, they'll sign in, they'll approve permissions, and the system will redirect them back to your website at the redirect URL in the config.
Okay.
And that they'll have several parameters in the header, or they'll have several query parameters that they go to when they put that in the endpoint. Those headers include your state that you gave, so you got it back, and a code. And so on that endpoint, you'll want to call exchange, and you pass in the context and that code that they gave you. And so once you've called code, exchange will give you back a token. So exchange converts an authorization code into a token. And then once you get that token, once you got that token, you can now call config.tokenSource, and you pass in that token to the token source. And that'll give you back a token source. And once you got the token source, now you can call new client.
Wow, there's a lot of steps.
So this new client takes in the token source, and it gives back an HTTP client. And that HTTP client's got all the standard HTTP client functions like get, post, do, and it will authenticate with that token, with your token source that you got, all calls to that server.
So we've seen how to do login using username and password, and then we use JWT to maintain state, and in writing that to a cookie, and then before that, and likewise you could write that to local storage, stored in a cookie, stored in local storage, whatever you want. And then we also saw a state being maintained with, I got to go back and look at my notes here, authentication with JWT, and then hands-on exercises, and we had our list of encryption stuff is like an overview. Am I past it? Is it this way?
It's still up.
It's still farther up. And here it is, right? And so we did JWT, and then we also did HMAC, right?
Yeah.
Was it HMAC just to store?
Yeah, HMAC is a signing method.
And HMAC was using SHA, and we used that to kind of create state. You're logged in. And now we're going to see how to do that with OAuth.
So OAuth lets you authenticate with another server. And so once you're authenticated with that other server, you can ask that server what's the ID of who this is. And then you can create your own JWT tokens
Yeah.
logging in to that point.
Oh.
So it's a replacement for the login process,
Instead of
username,
username and password.
password.
Got
It doesn't affect how you create your own sessions.
Got it. Got it. Okay. All right. So that's a little bit of an overview on the package.
So yeah, fill out your config, auth-code URL, redirect the user to the results of auth-code URL. When you get back, pass your code into Exchange, put the token through token source, and then call new client.
Easy. This should only take me an hour.
So
I'll be ready by the time we go home. I'll be ready by the end of the day. I'm feeling a little bit tired. I think that tells me I'm back in overwhelmed territory. I'm like, oh man, I got to read all this. I want to understand it.
So on our next video, we'll show how to look up the documentation for a particular OAuth provider. Probably through GitHub, because they've got the simplest OAuth provider
See, I'm yawning.
process.
All right, see you in the next video.